Like in the UK, if you're trying to hire someone, you can't necessarily have a requirement that is saying you have to have a certain number of years of experience unless you can really back that up, because you can't discriminate against younger people in the UK. It's not just, older people like in the US, it's younger people as well.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. With restrictions on both immigrant and non immigrant visas expected to continue for the foreseeable future, many U.S. firms are accelerating the relocation of professional roles, not just call centers, but core functions like software development, finance, legal, and engineering to other countries. Over 30% of US based multinational companies' employees are now located offshore. But while large companies like Salesforce, ExxonMobil, Goldman Sachs can readily build new offices in other countries, many small and medium sized businesses are also looking for ways to recruit hard to find talent across borders. I'm joined today by Susan Snipes. Susan is a certified HR professional with 15 years of HR experience, and she serves as the head of people at Remote People, a company that recruits top talent in over 150 countries around the world. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Susan.
Hi, Mike. It's great to be here.
So let's start with the why. What problems are U.S. employers trying to solve when they seek talent internationally?
Largely, they're looking at the cost. So we're looking at how it's a lot more cost effective to hire globally than it is to hire in the US. The talent is more cost effective. So when we're looking to hire tech talent, we might be looking in Brazil or Argentina or India, Pakistan, or Nigeria are some popular places to hire tech talent. You might be looking to hire customer service professionals in the Philippines, for example. It's definitely cost is the primary factor, but also there might be just a talent shortage. So with tech talent, for example, companies are finding that they have to look in other countries to find the talent that they need because there's just not enough domestically. So that's a combination of being cost effective and then also just the talent being elsewhere and having to go look for it.
Yeah, and whether we like it or not, we're in a global economy, right? And employers of all sizes have customers across borders, people with unique needs across borders, and the US talent market is pretty contained. I mean, we have what we have available, but with unemployment down around 4%, it's hard to fill jobs sometimes, and we look across the borders to find it. I'm in Texas, and we have sometimes even differences between cities as far as what the rules and regulations are. I mean, in Fort Worth versus Austin, which is hardly part of Texas in a lot of ways, but I mean, has its own rules about how you have to do certain things in the employment process, and much less state to state laws being different, Texas versus California versus New York. If we're thinking about international, that brings a whole nother set of compliance issues. So what are the main compliance and regulatory hurdles that employers face when they're trying to hire talent in other countries?
Yes, so the first hurdle is, are you hiring them correctly? Are you classifying them correctly as a employee versus an independent contractor? Because the most obvious workaround to having to go through all of the headache of employing someone is to say, hey, no, you're self-employed. That works really well for a lot of people. However, oftentimes people are misclassified based on the local laws. So that's something that might be cute when you're looking at one or two people in a country, but when you start to grow and you definitely don't want to be accused of misclassifying people. That's a PR nightmare, and you want to be able to do things above board. So
We see that, right? Even here in the US, every time we talk about changing the standards for what the income level for a non-exempt employee is, I get, I start getting questions from clients, and probably 80% of the time I'm saying that person shouldn't be exempt even under current law, they're not, you're misclassifying them, or you're classifying them as independent contractors, and you've got way too much control over what they're doing on a daily basis for them to be independent contractors.
Right.
So beyond classification, I know from our own experience, you've got concerns about health standards for providing health care and things like that. What are some other hurdles? Yeah.
Yeah, once you make the decision to say you're an employee, then you have to figure out, well, how am I going to put this person on payroll? And how am I going to withhold payroll taxes? How am I going to offer the benefits that are required by law? How am I going to remit things to the government? Like if there's statutory pension, for example, how am I going to get that remitted? And that's where companies will oftentimes turn to employers of record to help support them in these other countries.
And so an employer record, what does that mean?
An employer of record is a company that hires your employees for legal purposes. And so the employment contract is through them, the benefits are through them, and the payroll taxes are through them. You are still the employer for purposes of supervising the individual from day to day, but for all other intents and purposes, they are the employee of this other company, and that helps with a lot of the compliance burden. They provide a lot of resources, so that you're aware of what mandatory holidays there are, what are the overtime requirements in that country. So they're a good resource. They are expensive, more but perhaps a good way to go and more cost effective if you're only hiring a few people in a country versus trying to set up your own legal entity to and go through that headache and the ongoing headache of the compliance and all the paperwork that goes along with that.
So is there, in the US, we're used to professional employer organizations, right? PEOs. Is that basically what an employer of record is, or is there a different on the international basis between a PEO versus an EOR?
It's similar, except that for with the PEO, you're still the employer. The PEO is only the employer for payroll and benefits purposes, but legally speaking, you're still the employer. The offer letter that is sent to the employee or the employment contract, that's between you and the employee. Versus with an employer of record, that employment contract is between the employer of record and the employee.
So it's just like a staffing agency then. Like if we went to a local staffing agency to hire a contractor, a temp, or have somebody on our team from another agency that does engineering staffing or whatever, but they work for that other company and are just on assignment
Mhm.
to us. That's what we would be, even if it's a long-term employment, multiple years, they still work for this company in this other country,
Yes,
and that company is basically leasing them back to us, or we're
correct.
paying some markup. Dealing with things like that, does an employer like the U.S. based employer who's dealing with that, they're looking, we've got a compensation strategy, we've got benefit strategies, and things like that that we're working on in the U.S. to attract and retain the kind of employees we want. How does that, when we go, overseas, whether it's, Europe or Southeast Asia or Mexico or wherever it's at, Philippines, does our local strategy even matter when we're looking internationally, or do we just, look at what the customs are there and begin to follow those, whether we set up our own office there or we decide that we're going to use an employer of record?
So you definitely want to take into consideration the norms of the location where you're looking to hire, simply because there might be things like, in Germany, someone might expect to have a company car if they're traveling for work, or they might expect to have an allowance for their personal vehicle if they have to drive their own personal vehicle. Um, there might be different holidays that employees are accustomed to having off in a certain part of the world. So, whether they're statutorily required or not, they might expect to have these things, these benefits. They might be accustomed to having 4 weeks of vacation starting off, and it might be illegal or just counterintuitive to offer them less than that because they might pass on that offer if you're coming in, below standard.
If it's an employer of record, who's going to do the recruiting? I mean, do the ER, does the EOR you're going to work with, do they do the recruiting for you, or is an employer primarily Are they going to engage a recruitment firm, or are they going to do it themselves, or does the EOR typically handle that?
So it varies. There are some employer of records that offer recruitment services. Those are out there. Remote people is one of them. We also, there are a lot of employers that like to do the recruiting themselves. The challenges that they face when they do that, a lot of times just not knowing how to get in front of people in different countries, not having the local expertise in a given country to know which job boards to use can be a problem. And also, there could be issues with time zones and it being, less convenient to recruit themselves.
Right. Yeah, doing that in house when somebody's living on the other side of the planet and they're 8, 9, 10 hours time difference would, I guess, be a real challenge. And we have, even, I guess, in the US, specific rules about what you can and can't say in a job posting. And Colorado is different than Texas, and some states require that there be minimum salaries published and things like that, or
Right.
things like that.
Like in the UK, if you're trying to hire someone, you can't necessarily have a requirement that is saying you have to have a certain number of years of experience unless you can really back that up because you can't discriminate against younger people in the UK. It's not just, older people like in the US, it's younger people as well.
So that would make it more of a competency based hire. You'd have to really test if you really want a certain level of experience. You can't say necessarily 10 years experience, but I guess you test for competencies, or how do you get around, how do you get the right person? I'm not saying, I don't want to say get around it, but how do you get the right person if you're not just looking at
Yeah,
years?
you're definitely having to bring your A game with your technical questions that you're asking people on your interviews. And if you have any skills tests you can roll out, then those are helpful.
Interesting. Let's say we do either, we open an office or create a corporate entity in another country to house these employees, or we're using them through an employer of record, but we're still going to integrate them in our teams, right? So what have you seen work, and what has been tried that you've seen not work when you're trying to integrate foreign employees, foreign from the point of view of the US employees, into a team?
I would say that it's a good practice to make sure that you have if you want to integrate, you want to make sure that you have some overlap with the time zone and that you don't want to entirely require someone in Southeast Asia to work US hours because that would completely burn them out, but maybe there'd be a 4 to 5 hour window where they're overlapping with core US business hours so that they can participate in team activities and be on meeting calls.
So
So,
that would mean scheduling meetings at times, maybe we need to have certain
super
meetings
early in the
at
morning.
early in the morning or late in the evening, depending on which side of the globe they're on from us. Okay, that would make a lot of sense, and that's why I think, it seems like a lot of companies are talking more and more about nearshoring, trying to keep somebody, in North or South America who's closer to our time zone, so that they can maybe, operate with teams more collaboratively all day long.
Yes.
And so, what are some other things that you can do to help integrate these foreign-based employees into a company culture? Because you could really screw up your company culture if you're not careful with how you do that, I think.
You definitely want to make sure that the managers are sensitive to different holidays. Like if you say you were to hire someone in Pakistan, well, they might expect to have the Eid holiday off. So you'd want to make sure the managers are educated on possible religious accommodations that they may need to make, certain holidays that are even just, you have employees in Australia and they have a whole set of holidays that you don't have in the US, but they expect to have them off. You don't want it to be a surprise that half the team is missing like on a day and like where'd they go?
Yeah, yeah. You don't want to have an all hands meeting and have a third of your team not there and not understand why. In foreign countries are, they I'm sure most often uh, these employees will speak English, but they probably even there have different idioms, different local ways of speaking English. I'm from Texas, and I sound very different and use different colloquialisms than somebody in New York. In fact, my youngest son is at Oberlin in Ohio, and he'll be a senior this fall, And some of the things that he says that he's grown up hearing here, and especially hearing me say, he's used some of those idioms, and people in his friends from the Northeast have no clue what he's talking about, or they just start laughing. It's cold up there, it's hot down here, and I've said things, I would always say, and he's picked it up. It's colder than a well digger's belt buckle, and
Oh
his
my goodness.
think that's hilarious. And so I can imagine internationally, in a business setting, you could really step on somebody's toes if you don't understand what an idiom means, or if you say something in a certain way. So I would guess managers need to be sensitive to that. And how do you get everybody to be nice to each other? I mean, yeah, I guess we've got to build a culture where people are understanding that we have these cultural differences.
Yeah, so you can have sensitivity training for managers. You can also be really deliberate, and have people share about their cultures, and have maybe one call a month where you're featuring somebody from a different part of the world, and they're telling something fun about their culture. Maybe they're cooking their favorite dish, maybe they're telling a story about what it's like where they live, but just getting to know people better, and just exposure.
Describing local holidays, things like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got this holiday coming up. This is our Independence Day, and this is what it means for us. Or it's amazing. My number two son lives in Norway, and I saw on his Instagram they're celebrating Norwegian Independence Day, and he's lived there he's in just finished his fifth season with the ballet there. And I sent him a note. So who are they celebrating independence from? And he said, I have no idea. And so,
Oh, wow.
yeah, but he was celebrating it because he was in Norway and he's hanging out with his friends, and it was an excuse to drink, I guess. So those are, I mean, understanding those kind of things, and I guess sharing in them with your teammates who are in other parts of the world. So if you have an employer of record, they're handling all the legal issues and making sure that you're compliant, that you're not going to get in trouble. Do you have a sense of, they're going to have to advise that local manager, though, and that US based manager, I guess, on what they can and can't do? Do you see companies get in trouble, or do they mostly listen, or do they, does a good employer of record really give them enough information to stay out of the equivalent
Honestly,
EEOC
that's a big
violation?
gap. It's a big gap because it's designed to be kind of plug and play, so you have access to all of these resources on different labor laws, but the manager's not sitting there reading up on it, and there's no training being provided by the employer of record to the manager usually. So it is a gap. They can step in it for sure.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. So, we're talking about not just remote employees today, but employees who are actually located in other countries. Whether you're using a contractor, a PEO, or an employer of record, or just hiring someone directly, how do you know they really are who they say they are? Identity fraud in employment is on the rise, especially internationally. Dishonest job seekers are using fake or stolen identity information to apply for and often actually obtain employment. In fact, if you've watched my webinar on preventing remote worker fraud, you know that the North Korean government has for the last decade been stealing US tech workers' identities and then using that information to get real remote work jobs with US companies, violating US sanctions and perpetrating frauds against those employers. In order to better protect our clients, Imperative is introducing new tools to prevent identity fraud. With our new biometric identity verification process, we validate the identity documents candidates present and use AI to capture a video selfie of the individual and verify that it matches the photo on their ID. And the whole process takes less than 5 minutes. For more information on this cutting-edge service, reach out to me or visit our website at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 205 and enter the keyword offshore. That's OFFSHORE. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. That's where you'll also find the recorded webinar I mentioned earlier, Alt, Control, Deceive, protecting yourself from remote employee fraud. And now back to my conversation with Susan Snipes. What are if I'm thinking about hiring? Let's say I'm not already global, and I've got 5 positions I need to place someplace internationally, and I want to look at international talent. Maybe I don't even know that I'm going to do it. Um, how do I what are the factors to decide whether I want to hire direct and set up some sort of entity in this other country versus maybe use a local PEO and where they are really doing a certain amount of the work and pushing the burden back on us on some of it, or just a straight employer of record. What are the considerations that an employer would consider there?
Yeah, so you need to understand your risk tolerance and also, because the first step again is are we going to say these are employees? Or are they independent contractors? That's the first stage. And then once we've decided that yes, they are employees, maybe they need to be just to be able to offer them the kind of benefits that they're expecting locally. Maybe they need to be. Then you have to ask yourself, are you hiring a lot of people in this country? Or do you have to hire quickly? Do you need to move fast? If you need to move fast, then maybe you need to start off with an employer of record and then down the line think about having your own legal entity at some point. If you're just testing the market, if you're just testing it out to see, do I want to hire people here? Will this be effective? You definitely would want to use an employer of record for that. So those are a few considerations.
How does that employer of record pricing work? And to clarify, uh, your firm's not an EOR, right? Y'all just do the recruiting, or do you do EOR work as?
We partner very closely with an employer of record, so we can help anybody who needs employer of record services.
How does the pricing work with an EOR then?
So some of them are a per employee per month model, and some of them have a flat monthly.
Interesting. So, um, who's primarily negotiating? If you're using an employer of record in another country, who's negotiating salary generally? There is that the EOR, or is that the domestic based U.S. company that's using
The
that?
US company is deciding what's going to be paid, and they're communicating that to the employer of record, and the employer of record is making sure that ends up in the contract. If there was something that couldn't be offered a certain way because it wasn't legal to do it that way, then the employer of record would push back on the US entity and say, "Hey, we can't offer this. We need to make this has to be included. We have to offer this many vacation days."
Yeah, yeah. PTO is very different. Some places, well, just like in the U.S., some places don't have regulations. You do whatever PTO balance or accumulation you want, while others have a certain amount of set time off, separate from a sick leave, paid sick leave bank, things like that. So I can imagine internationally every legislature thinks it's got the unique best idea for doing that and accommodating that. But that kind of brings up another issue. Let's say in the US we give our employees 25 days of paid time off, and it's a combined sick leave PTO kind of system. But you get in another country where they've got them banked out. Do you see employers like balancing those, for equity purposes? I want the same people on this team, whether they're in the US or elsewhere, to have some equity in the amount of time they get off. So do you say, okay, well, you're in Mexico, so these are all those mandatory days off in Mexico, so we're going to scoop those out of what we would normally give a U.S. citizen as a PTO base? Or how do you see employers like doing that, or is it just all over the board?
I mean, generally, it just results in US employers being more generous to the US team because we tend to offer less than most other countries. So, um, giving the US folks more time off because we got to be fair because the employees in France get this much time off. So we got to make sure that the US folks do too. Or maybe we're giving the US folks more public holidays because there's just some more public holidays offered. I mean, generally, there's exceptions, of course, but that's what I see mostly.
And one of the big things that everybody's always concerned about with remote work in general, but especially, when you're talking cross border, is data security. And everybody gets, we've got proprietary information, and we're giving somebody in another country access to maybe our network and our customer
Mhm.
information, proprietary information.
Yeah,
What special concerns are there?
yeah, you gotta make sure you have virtual desktops where employees are having to log into these virtual desktops to be able to access anything, any of your company systems from their devices, because you're not gonna ship a company laptop to the Philippines. You're not probably going to do that, but you can have a virtual desktop. Hopefully I'm using the right term there, but
Right. Yeah.
it's just to ensure that they're having to go through protected system.
And so a virtual desktop, remote desktop, something like that, where they can log in and they see that instance of the computer, their company computer, and they're using the internet basically as a monitor, a cable for your monitor, your keyboard, and your mouse, and but all the processing is being done on the far end of on the other, on the company server. That's and larger employers have those systems. I would expect that smaller employers maybe take their chances, if they don't have that kind of setup. But that would be one of the things that would make me nervous as an employer,
Mhm,
have good controls on those systems. But I've seen setups where even remote employees in the states, especially if they're using a company laptop, have to connect to company drives when they're connected, and so everything's saved out on a drive someplace, even if it's not a remote.
mhm,
And
yes,
then when you reboot the computer, everything's wiped locally, so you don't store any files locally. So if somebody steals that computer, they're not getting anything except a $600 laptop. But it's interesting that you said a lot of them are still allowing people to work on their local computer, their own computers, rather than drop shipping them a PC. I think that's interesting. That surprises me.
yeah, it's
Just
pretty
that,
prevalent.
yeah,
A lot of
interesting. Yeah.
a lot of people using their own personal devices, or even if the company, like, pays for a laptop as a perk or something, they're not having someone in the US configure it and then ship it out to them, you know? It needs to be something that's pretty I've used this word already on this podcast,
Mhm.
but it's like
Right.
pretty plug and play where there's like that virtual desktop type thing so that everything that they're accessing the company systems, they can't unless they're using that virtual desktop, they can't access it, and then they can use any device.
And so the day comes where I need to separate this employee or end this relationship with this employee. How is that different than what we see in the US? And because especially when there's an employer record or PEO or somebody in between, what do you see those standard arrangements look like? If I need to term somebody, I'm sure there's, just like we have here, there's going to be some government regulation of that entity that's housing that employee is going to have to maybe owe them severance or something. So how does that typically work for the U.S. employer?
Yeah, you work closely with the employer of record to make sure that you're in compliance with the final pay and everything like that for the departing employee. You would get on a call like this with them so that you're terminating them face to face, even though you're very far apart, possibly with a witness on the call. So
Hmm.
it's it's awkward sometimes.
Well, anytime I mean, but it's the kind of awkward that we signed up for when we got in HR too, right?
Yes. Yes.
So
It's that kind of awkward.
yeah, that's what they pay us the big dollars for. So and severance and those kind of things, are those typically just, if there's a country that requires it, are those banked up over time, anticipating that, or is that something that generally you just, okay, it's, we don't need this person anymore, we're ending the relationship, and we just write the check when, to the EOR at that time.
I mean, the employer should be aware if there's going to be something like where you have to give pay in lieu of notice. For
Mhm.
example, like maybe you're required to give an employee a certain amount of notice when you terminate them, or else you have to pay them in lieu,
Mhm.
then that's something that they should plan for and not be surprised at the last minute that they have to do.
Those are all the kind of questions. I think we've covered a lot of the questions that an employer should really ask before they get into the situation, so they know what they're walking into.
Definitely.
Well, that is all the time we have. Thanks for joining me today, Susan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please write us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're listening. And share this episode on your favorite social media platform. It helps people who need us find us. And we'd love to hear your thoughts at goodmorninghr.com. The show is produced by Marianne Hernandez and Paco Corral, and our theme music is by the BJ Leaderman of HR himself, Steve Pegler of HR Strategies of Texas. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.